And Mr. Chair, we had about 7 people registered to be in attendance tonight, so
All right,
just so you're aware.
just so I'm aware. That's good. Okay, I'm just waiting for my little clock to tick over to 7 so we can legitimately start. It is 7 o'clock and I welcome everybody to the April meeting of the Planning Advisory Committee for the Town of St. Andrews. We have everyone in attendance except for Mr. Cross, who is unavoidably away on his work this evening, so cannot be joining us. I would look for a motion to approve the agenda as it is here presented.
Mr. Chair, I move that we accept the agenda as presented.
Ms. Stewart. And a seconder.
I'll second that.
Mr. Simmons. Okay, if you're ready for the question, all those in favor of adopting the agenda as presented signify by raising your hand. All are in favor, so that is carried. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest for this meeting? Councillor Heenan, would you please state your...
Yes, Mr. Chair, regarding the presentation on 140 Frederick Street, I believe I'm in a conflict of interest because I'm on the board of the church and plus it's a neighbor. So,
Very good, sir.
thank you.
Anybody else? No. Okay, we go to confirmation of minutes. We have 2 sets of minutes to look at. First of all, for the regular meeting of March 16th. Does anybody see any problems in there? If not, I'll look for a motion to adopt those minutes. Councillor Heenan. The seconder, Ms. Stewart. So again, if nobody has any issues to record on that, all those in favor of the motion signify by raising your hand. Okay, all hands up. That is good. The second set of minutes is for the special meeting that was held on March the 31st. You've seen those minutes. Does anybody have any problems arising from those? If not, I'll look for a motion to adopt those minutes. Councillor Heenan. Seconder.
White.
Okay, Mr. Ingalls. Okay, I thought I saw a hand flash there, but I was looking down at my page, so I wasn't sure who it was. Okay, if there are no problems with that, if you're ready for the question, all those in favor of adopting those minutes signify by raising your hand. All hands up, so we are good. That brings us into our main agenda items, and the first of these is the application regarding 140 Frederick Street, the rebuild request, legal non-conforming use authorization. Okay, let us turn to that. The planning report was prepared by Mr. Henderson, and he is away due to another commitment. So Mr. Gopin is prepared to take us through this. So I will turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So don't hold me responsible for what Alex has done here, but I have a pretty good understanding of the report and the issue at hand here. So I'll do my best to take you through it. And Zach, everybody can see that presentation there?
Yep.
Awesome. So this is, I think, the first time that PAC has had a legal non-conforming use application. This is for 140 Frederick Street, where there tragically was a fire and the house was damaged beyond repair and had to be demolished. it was a single unit dwelling or single family dwelling, basically a house. And the request is to rebuild on the same lot with the same footprint as the original dwelling. The reason why this is coming to you tonight is that the original dwelling basically was, probably built long before zoning standards and therefore does not conform to the modern standards. So it becomes legally non-conforming, and that's under Section 60 of the Community Planning Act. When a house is damaged more than 50%, if it's less than 50%, then PAC does not have to authorize its reconstruction. You can just get a building permit for it, even if it's legally non-conforming and doesn't meet the current standards. But in the case where more than 50% is damaged and they wish to rebuild on the same footprint and it's legally non-conforming, then PAC, it's your authority whether that can be rebuilt or not. So there's the section of the Community Planning Act. Despite the zoning bylaw, PAC can allow or disallow the repair, restoration, or use of a building or structure containing a legal non-conforming use that has been damaged to an extent of at least half the whole building or structure above the foundation. In this case, it's not actually the use that's legally non-conforming, because the use is allowed in the zone, in the service residential zone. A house is obviously allowed there. It's just the dimensional standards which are legally non-conforming. And as I said before, the original home was destroyed by a fire and more than 50% was damaged. I think it was basically insurance saying this is too far gone to be repaired and it needs to be demolished and rebuilt. So this is obviously not the most up-to-date aerial imagery. It's this property here, that's 140 Frederick. And so that's the structure there that was destroyed by the fire and demolished. And there you can see some pictures from the site after the demolition. And just a few more pictures from the site. So as I mentioned, this is zone service residential. And below, Alex has prepared a table kind of showing where the proposed rebuild at the original location where it doesn't meet the standard. So the front yard, it only has a 1.3 meter setback, although I'll talk a little bit more about that later. One of the side yards is not big enough, although it's pretty close, 1.3 meters to 1.5 meters. The lot width is quite a bit narrower, and the lot area is it's pretty close, but just a little under. So the zoning bylaw says that setbacks have to be 2 meters or setbacks on either side, whichever is greater. So even if both houses are right up at the street line, if you still have to go back 2 meters. Whereas if both houses were set back more than 2 meters, then you would have to go as far back as them. The secondary municipal plan, this is not a actual proposal, so it's not a binding statement, but it is a best practice, and so I think it's worth thinking about in this situation. All new buildings should be located at the appropriate setback from the street, with enough front lawn space to mimic the general pattern. New construction does not need to align perfectly with the adjacent structures or properties, but must respect the required setbacks of the area and context. I'll just go back to this. So you can see that the house next to it is set back a little bit more, but in the case of this house here, it's pretty much right at the street line. This house here is right at the street line. So most of the houses are actually up at the street line there. And you can see there that house at street line. That house is set back, certainly more than the 2 meters. So what PAC is being asked to decide on tonight is whether restoring the structure in the former location should be allowed. And there actually is a guideline for determining this from the provincial planning branch, and it provides the following guidance. In examining the extent of compatibility of the non-conforming use with any other surrounding non-conforming uses and with other permitted uses in the same zone, the more the use is compatible with other uses, the more it should be tolerated. So what that's basically saying is if there's a lot of legally non-conforming uses, it makes sense to be a little bit more lenient to allowing legally non-conforming uses to continue in cases where there's a discretionary decision to be made. And ultimately, you do want to bring things into conformity, but there's a very specific right and regulation under the Act in this case about legally non-conforming uses in the case of destruction. So there are rights there as well. If PAC allows the illegally non-conforming residential use to be restored, in those, really the footprint is the thing to think about. It has to consider the terms of compatibility with surrounding other non-conforming uses and other permitted uses in the zone. And given that there are other legally non-conforming uses in the area, that's definitely worth considering. So the point here is, as I sort of was showing in the picture, there's 0 meter setbacks at 132 and 148 Frederick. And the lot right next door at 144 is a significantly undersized lot, quite a bit more than this one here. And again, all over the town plat, you have a lot of stuff built before modern zoning standards. So while there is certainly patterns, there is inconsistency as well. And this is certainly not like a row of townhouses that all have exactly the same frontage. Another really important thing to think about in this case is fire safety. And obviously, it's kind of very lucky that this fire in this case did not spread to the neighboring buildings. I know there was some very minor damage, smoke entering and surface kind of damage, but nothing structural. And so, given reduced setbacks, although they're pretty close, I think just one was 0.2 meters off. But it is very important to think about these things when you have buildings so close together. So this was reviewed by our senior building inspector, and they consulted with the town's fire chief. And while the zoning bylaw is dealing with setbacks from a sort of, I would say, an aesthetic intent to have certain consistency and certain space between homes for aesthetic, light, kind of neighborhood character reasons, there are other acts that deal with fire safety when it comes to buildings being close together. So the National Building Code deals a lot with fire safety, as you might expect. And the house would need to be rebuilt to modern building code or 2015 building code, because that's what the province is using. And that does mean that it would limit the number of windows with the 1.3 meter side. There, I think, are certain material requirements. But if those are, if it's built to the building code, our senior building inspector and the fire chief are not concerned that this would present any extraordinary fire safety concerns in terms of spreading to neighboring properties. And St. Andrews actually has an under 10-minute fire department response time, which is really good. Not a lot of municipalities, sort of rural municipalities, have that. So that does lessen the requirements a little bit, but again, there's still stringent requirements about fire safety in terms of how the structure is built. So again, the town fire chief has no concern. There was neighborhood polling within 100 meters. Some neighbors had no concerns, but other neighbors, including one of the ones next door, were concerned with the rebuild mostly due to fire safety. And if there was a fire again, what would happen? it's, I'll say Alex's opinion. He is the generic planning staff in this case. That given that this would need to be rebuilt to national building code, and that this would match the street pattern, given that you have homes that are 0 meters setback. Given those factors, that PAC should consider allowing the restoration of a legal non-conforming use of a single unit dwelling with the dimensional standards for the original structural footprint and as shown on the site plan. Of course, they still have to meet the other provisions of the zoning bylaw and national building code, most importantly, because that will deal with the fire safety issues. So I believe that's it for the presentation, and I will do my best to answer any questions. I believe the applicant is online as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gopin. Do we have questions for him? I hear nothing. Oh, Mr. Ingles.
Sorry, Xander, I know you said modern zoning standards. You mentioned that term. And could you explain that a little bit more in relation to what standards were there before? Because to me, a lot of these setbacks are, and I could be wrong, they're more reflective of our times now than what was built 100 years ago. So I'm just wondering whether there's any concern about having a closer setback, or the setback that was existing, that was done 100 years ago, as to what you're asking for now. I mean, if you're asking for a larger setback, why are we asking for a larger setback, for example? Is it for infrastructure? Is it for other utilities? What is that? Why do we have that setback now?
Part of the reason for it, and this is something I've read, and doesn't necessarily come from the province or the municipality, but there was a time when it was thought that municipalities might want to expand roads.
Mm-hmm.
And they might need to take even more of the right of way. And so having a larger front yard setback would allow for that. Now, I don't think that's a realistic possibility. And I think in the case of, if this was, let's say, a legally non-conforming use or placement where all the other houses on the block were set back 7 meters, and this one happened to be right up at the front of the lot, and they wanted to rebuild. I think in that case, it would be very reasonable to say, well, there's a street pattern here where everything is set back, and a rebuild should match that. In this case, you have several other legally non-conforming uses on the block. There's, in my opinion, there's no, except for just kind of, this is a pattern. This is something to have things be, and most things conform to it. But if you look around the plat, you'll see other cases where there's 0 meter setbacks. So I think the direction from the secondary municipal plan is really good to look at there, where it says, look at the actual street itself and not necessarily the specific dimensional standard.
But with that said, a lot of times you'll see a setback established by the 2 adjacent buildings, and they'll take the medium point between the two. If one's at 0, one's at 8, then that one will be at 4. So there's a gradual step back. So it also creates a rhythm along the street. So that's another way we can look at that as well.
Yeah. Now, I will say, I think in this specific case, and maybe the applicant could speak to this more, I believe for insurance to consider this a rebuild, it has to be rebuilt on the same footprint. So that is part of the consideration as well, is that, and I believe you should ask the applicant about that, but if it has to be moved, it might make the insurance process much more difficult. But I definitely hear your point about there is, kind of a stepping that could be done. And in this case, there aren't really conditions So it's either it gets rebuilt there or it gets rebuilt as per the zoning bylaw, and then they would have to probably come for some variances as well down the line.
And then one other question, and maybe you don't know this, and maybe it's more to the applicant. Because I'm sure when this was built, there was no cars. So what about parking? What about parking on the site? I'm sure these people have at least 2 cars. Is there room in the front to still do parking? Or do you know that? Or is that more to the applicant we should ask?
You should probably address that to the applicant, I think. Mr.
Yeah, I will say that for a single family dwelling, only 1 parking spot would be required.
Okay.
On the lot
Okay,
itself.
good. Okay, thank you.
Right, anything else for Mr. Gopin? All right, Mr. Knopper, do we have the applicant with us?
Yes, your chair, the applicant is with us, so I'm going to allow Mr. Jeremy Hache to speak. Mr. Hache, you have the floor to the PAC. If you could unmute, they would like to ask you some questions.
Sure. Hi, can everybody hear me?
We can
Yes,
hear you.
indeed.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the meeting. To the question that was just asked about parking, we did park, so facing the house from the street, we parked along the left-hand side. There was about, I sent a hand-drawn sketch in of the property with the dimensions of the house. And on the side where it notes 3.1 meters from the left wall to the property pin, that was the area we used for parking, and we could get pretty much to the back of the house in that parking area. So we actually had room for 3 cars, kind of one in front of the other.
Dwight. It's that one, Dwight.
Yeah, that's it right there. So you can see one parked way down at the back, and then I usually parked up close to the front, just on the back edge of the sidewalk.
All right, Mr. Hache, do you have any other comments that you would like to address to us, or would you like to take questions?
Well, I guess one of the things that I would like to say to Mr. Gopin's point, that the insurance process will get more time consuming and I guess complicated if we don't build in the same footprint like the way the structure was before. I can't say exactly how complicated it will get or what hurdles we'll need to overcome, because we're not at that point yet. I've got my fingers crossed for this. So if it does get to that point, we'll see that as it moves forward.
All right, because that is the one thing that I did not see anywhere in the materials we have is the answer to the question, why the desire to build on the original footprint rather than trying to be more conforming to the strictures of the current bylaw.
Well, in trying to navigate through this insurance process, right now, the insurance company is responsible for replacing what we had. Now, there are opportunities to, if there's anything over and above, for example, that I would like to have included, like, for example, if we wanted to have a full basement instead of the rock foundation that was there, those are sort of things that we could talk about when it comes to the building design. But if we have to change the footprint of the house, we pretty much go back to the drawing board, and I can't be sure what the implications will be with the insurance company. At present, they're responsible for replacing what was there.
Okay. Does anyone else have questions for the applicant?
Just one question. Do you know roughly the square footage of the existing building that was there, or what you're planning to build?
Well, so there were 2 floors of finished space, the main floor and the top floor. The basement didn't have any usable space. It was pretty much like a dirt floor. I think it had about 5 feet of ceiling height, but the finished space was about 2,200 square feet.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? If not, then we'll say thank you, Mr. Hache, for your appearance this evening.
Well, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
You're quite welcome. Mr. Knopper, do we have anyone who is wishing to speak to this matter?
Your chair, we have 3 others on the call here. I'll ask the 3 representatives here. Can you please raise your hand? You will find your hand raising at either at the top or the bottom of your screen if you would wish to speak to the 140 Frederick Street. I'll give another call. If anybody wishes to speak to 140 Frederick Street, please raise your hand on your Zoom function. I haven't seen any hands raised there either.
Very well then. That brings the matter to us. And we have a proposed motion upon the recommendation of the planners. Does anyone wish to put forward that motion or any other form of motion?
Well, Mr. Chair, I would move that we accept staff's recommendation by allowing for the restoration of a legal non-conforming use of a single unit dwelling at 140 Frederick Street as per the staff planning report.
Do I have a seconder for that motion? I have Mr. Simmons. All right. The motion is before you. Is there any discussion upon it?
Well,
If
actually,
not- yes,
sorry.
sir. Go right ahead.
I was just going to say, I think Mr. Gopin's presentation regarding, the general pattern and feel of the street was quite helpful, and the guidelines that he followed and walked us through, I found very helpful in me making this decision.
Okay, good. Anything else? If not, if you're ready for the question, all those in favor signify by raising your hand. I see all hands raised, so we are good. Thank you. That motion is declared passed. Our second item for consideration this evening is the request from the owners of 258 Montague Street to rezone to tourism commercial for the purposes of continuing a tea house that was provided a temporary use permit in 2021. Mr. Ingles, were you looking to?
I was just going to say, should we bring our counselor back in? for this
Oh,
discussion?
yes. Thank you for
Don't put him on
reminding me.
ice.
Councillor Heenan, come back to us.
I have sent him an email to see if he'll get that as well.
Oh dear, if he's off having a martini somewhere.
Exactly.
He should be pretty familiar with this file because he has had it presented to him before as a counselor.
I'm sure, but I would just like to see him come back. Oh, well, I guess at his own leisure be it. So
He's saying he can't get back in, so give me 2 seconds. I'll make sure he gets
all right.
back in. So,
technology. What do we do without it? What do we do with it?
I was giving a presentation earlier today, and as I went into it, I made a joke about starting the presentation without actually sharing my screen, because I've done that several times. And obviously I didn't do that. I got halfway through my presentation. They said, "We're not seeing the slides change." And I had an issue with 2 screens, and they were seeing everything at once in night animation. So you can't win. You just can't win.
All your work.
Oh, well, these things are sent to try us. So anyway, we are on the matter of 258 Montague. And you, Mr. Gopin, are responsible for the planning report on this one. So I will turn it over to you and let you have at it.
And this one I will take full responsibility for. Okay, so 258 Montague Street, also known as the Montague Rose, and it's now owned by Benjamin and Zainab Faulkner Malik, and they have applied for rezoning. Also involves a municipal plan amendment, so technically, We're giving views on both the rezoning and the municipal plan amendment. It's a map amendment to the municipal plan just because it's designated as a residential land use, and the tourist commercial zone is a commercial land use. So the bed and breakfast, the Montague Rose B&B, has operated on the site for quite some time, but long before it was under possession of the current owners. When the current owners purchased it, they wanted to expand what it was doing, and they applied for a temporary use authorization to operate a tea room, which under the zoning bylaw would just be a restaurant, and that the tea room would be open to the general public, not just patrons of the bed and breakfast, which is you're only allowed to serve food to guests of a bed and breakfast if you're a bed and breakfast. And actually, this is kind of a little bit similar to the Kingsbury Arms file. I believe you heard not too long ago they needed the rezoning for a liquor license. That's actually not in the plans in this case. But anyway, so there was a temporary use that was authorized from May 2021 that's coming up on expiring. There were conditions on the temporary use that related to parking and hours of operation. And interestingly enough, we meet our friend the building code again in a slightly different form this time. This was another file that I worked very closely with our building inspector on, and because this is an older building built long before modern building codes, it doesn't meet the standards of a typical restaurant under building code, which would be called an assembly use, where you have members of the general public coming in and staying for some amount of time longer than just coming in to shop. So the building code has much greater requirements for that type of use than for even just a retail use or a service use, like a barber shop or something like that. And in this case, I think it means the building would need to be sprinklered. It would need new drywall, very, very onerous and I think very expensive renovations. So it really is not feasible. So the use is already limited by that to some extent. But I believe the applicants have had a successful year, and they would like to keep the operation going more or less as it is. And because the year is up, the only way to keep that going is by rezoning. And in this case, it seems the tourist commercial zone is the most appropriate. As I mentioned, this does require a municipal plan map amendment. One of the really nice things about the temporary use allowance under the Community Planning Act is it allows people to test ideas, business ideas, as was the case, but it also allows a business idea to test the neighborhood in this case. So there was some concern initially from neighbors when the temporary use was granted, but in the year that it's been operating, we haven't heard anything about it. Municipal staff hasn't heard anything about it. So it seems that it has been quite compatible with what is, a fairly residential neighborhood. As you'll see here, you can kind of see the Montague Rose under there. This is next to the courthouse and that kind of green there. There are some residential uses on the block, but it's definitely a residential neighborhood that does have some institutional uses and some other bed and breakfasts in there as well. So here's an aerial view of the property. And this is a picture of the property. And in evaluating this rezoning, we looked at some municipal plan policies. Economic policies talk about encouraging further development and promotion of significant artistic, cultural, and recreational assets, with the view towards increasing economic opportunities and cultural tourism throughout the year. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in discussion. Also in housing, There's the discussion of home-based businesses, but there should be conditions to minimize the effect of home-based businesses on adjacent residential properties. No. So in thinking about the first point here, the economic policies, while there has been some renovations over the years to the structure, largely it is a very historic home, and as a bed and breakfast, it really isn't open to the general public. So it is a heritage asset in the town that is limited at the moment. So opening it to the general public would allow more people to engage with that asset. As well, the business concept of a tea room, serving kind of a British high tea service, that seems to me to be very in line with the types of tourist activities that happen in St. Andrews, and the general historical feel of the community, and the nod to the loyalist culture. So tea room seems to fit right in with that. And as far as I know, is not something that's offered anywhere else in town. So it is staff's opinion that the rezoning does meet the municipal plan goals, but conditions are very important, both for impact on the neighborhood and actually for the building code as well. So hours of operation and parking, those are kind of about making sure that it's not having an undue impact on the neighborhood. And the parking requirements come from the zoning bylaw. Now, our building inspector has recommended council apply additional conditions that really have to do with building code and making sure that this doesn't become a use that would not be allowed under the building code. So keeping the front door of the building open when possible, limiting where the tea room patrons are going who are not bed and breakfast guests, having reservations, that limits the number of people and gives a bit more control. But I think from a common sense point of view, if the tea room is empty and somebody comes by and says, I'd like to, sit down for a tea service, and there's room and there's no other reservations, I don't see why they couldn't have a reservation immediately. So I don't think that should have too much of an impact on the business operations. And services are to end at 7 p.m. So again, limiting the scale a little bit, but that also again aligns with some of the neighborhood kind of character concerns. And then again, limiting the number of patrons who are there. So again, it's just kind of not letting the use get out of control. That's really the building inspector's concern. So it can stay as a business and personal services use and not become an assembly use. Oh, and then also size does impact that. So limiting the space where the tea room is allowed. So it is a bit restrictive. If the applicant did wish to go through the process of bringing the entire building up to modern building code for the assembly use, then the conditions could be reconsidered by council, and most of them it would make sense to remove at that point. But the conditions would be set by resolution, and they could be changed by resolution, but council would have some control over that. So we're just at council is asking for PAC's views. There was a public hearing of objections last night, and no communications were heard there. Paul, Mr. Knopp can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think any communications have come in about this from the public hearing side. So really in a year, there was nothing said, and at this point, we haven't heard much, and council has moved it to first reading. So you're welcome to give views in any way you see fit. It can be discussion points, things to consider, or it can be a simple, we have no issue with it. So I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gopin. Does anyone have any questions for the planner? If not, then I'm just going to go do my Hollywood Squares thing and go along here and see what we have to say. Mr. Simmons.
I don't know if anybody else has taken the time to go down, but I'll just show you quickly. It's not very clear, but that's what the tea room serves. A couple of us went over right after they opened up. It's great for St. Andrews. It's, they really make you feel warm and coming in. And I just think it really fits St. Andrews. It really fits what Ben and Zana want to add on to Montague Rose. And honestly, I don't think they had any issues last summer. I know a bunch of the girls from the Herring did a little girls thing for a wedding. They all went there and did a little get together and used the tea room. So has many uses, and I think it really fits well for that area. And the B&B has been running for quite a while, so I don't think even the town should have any issue with it. And the neighbors, like you said, nobody showed up last night. So anyways, that's pretty well all I have to say. I mean, we just have to listen to the recommendations as well, and maybe Ben and Zana can also clarify what time they've been closing anyways, because they're also running a bed and breakfast, so they probably don't want people there very late anyways, right? So anyways, that's it for me.
Okay. Councillor Heenan.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Just kind of these owners really fit into the scheme of St. Andrews as I see it happening. They're very responsible, like they both or one have attended every hearing of this with no ulterior motive, just came to make sure what was happening, see if there were any objections. He was there last evening, and I'm very pleased with the way the operation is running. I live handy. I have never heard anything, and I really think it belongs. Thank you, Mr. Chair and
All right.
members.
Ms. Stewart.
Oh, I agree. I think it will be a good kind of punctuation point on everything they've been trying to achieve. So I support them in their endeavor.
Okay. Mr. Ingles.
I think what's interesting about this block that the property is on is that it's an interesting block because you have the old courthouse, you have the park space, and then you have like a little bit of a commercial, and then you have residential. So it's a block that's a bit of a mix, which can support something like this. The only question I have is, I know this would have to be zoned tourist commercial. It have to be rezoned tourist commercial zone. Is that what?
That's why we're having this discussion.
And so what other permits are allowed under tourist commercial zone?
Mr. Gopin, I think that's a question for you.
Let me just pull it up in the zoning bylaw. I mean, I, for example, the Algonquin is in the tourist commercial zone, so the use could get, in theory, it could be sold and get more intensive, and council could put conditions on to limit that. And that might be worth considering. I just want to look up exactly what's allowed in the zone.
Because if I recall, with Kingsbury Arms, we put one or two conditions on, so it just sort of modulated what they could actually do. And once again, like, it's one of those situations where we don't want to have.
Mr. Ingles, we didn't put them on, we recommended.
Recommended.
Yeah, because this is not within our purview. We're just
so
offering an opinion.
So a recommendation, just to make sure that, it doesn't get out of that scale and that scope.
Yeah, so the allowed uses in that zone are an artist studio or art gallery, hotel, motel, interhostel. So again, like the Algonquin is in that zone. Obviously you couldn't put the Algonquin on that parcel, but could imagine something more intense than what's there currently. Short-term rental, bed and breakfast, restaurant or dining room, souvenir gift shop, and then a touring, guiding, or outfitting service for tourists. And then there's a few conditional uses as well, but those would have to come back for conditions. So I think recommending to council that they consider limiting the use to I mean, I think all the conditions on it right now would pretty significantly limit the use, the hours of operations, the need for reservations, limiting it to 12 patrons. So I don't actually know if there's much point in recommending anything above and beyond that, because
Pretty
council will
locked
have
down.
to deal with that anyways if, you know, that changes.
Okay.
Right. So we find ourselves, if I'm reading the room correctly, we're finding ourselves in favor of proceeding as has been indicated. And that, so what I need is a motion to present that our opinion of approval to council. So is somebody
Mr.
prepared? Yes.
Sure, Mr. Chair, I will actually make a motion that we accept staff's recommendations and show our support to the town, including in particular the conditions detailed by the building inspector. I think it's they should not get lost in the mix.
Okay, I'm just making a note of that. Okay, is there a seconder for that motion? Mr. Simmons. Okay, any further discussion on that motion? If not, if you're ready for the question, all those in favor signify by raising your hand. All hands up, so we are carried. Very well. Does anyone have any new business to bring before the meeting this evening? Because I do, and I'm just going to wait and see if there's anybody else. Okay, if not, then I'm just going to make you aware, committee, that there has been an appeal lodged with the Provincial Planning and Appeal Board from the owners of 539 Brandy Cove Road. You may remember that we dealt with that issue of a variance for a height, a raising of the height level on that proposed building there, and we applied some conditions to it. They are appealing the inclusion of the first of those conditions, which was the hiring of an arborist to look at the tree line situation where they wanted to be cleared. I'm going to call myself at fault on this one. I think I was asleep at the switch when this was proposed, but I'm going to quote from the letter that the Mr. McClellan wrote to the board. The second paragraph of his letter says the following: PAC's job is to administer the bylaws, being as fair as they can to everyone, not create new conditions and rules that are not in the bylaws. In our case, the condition was placed by a member of the PAC because it was that person's personal preference, not tied to any bylaw for the town of St. Andrews. And this is what I call, of course, being a teacher by profession, one of these teachable moments. We have to remember that we work solely and exclusively within the established regulatory body of the town. And although we might like to see things done a little bit differently, and the matter of trees has come up in several cases, and we, if you recall, we did make a recommendation to council that they look more closely at this matter, and we referenced a section of the municipal plan for this. However, as things stand at the moment, we don't have any regulatory framework for this. So we should probably have excluded that condition on that basis. And if I'd been a little bit more alert, I probably would have made that point to you to see whether that would sway your opinion on that particular point. So I just want to make that. My opinion is that the Provincial Planning and Assessment Appeal Board will probably uphold that appeal, from Mr. McClellan, and that particular condition will be removed, but we live and learn. So any comment or question on that matter? Yes, Councillor Hainan.
Mr. Knopper, probably you remember our conversation that I had about, I wondered if we could redo that because I felt that was a stipulation that stepped beyond the bounds of PAC. I was not happy with that. I mean, that was just an absolute a blunder on our part. And I've been living with that ever since. So I'm really glad to see that it's coming up for appeal because it goes far beyond the scope of us. And so I feel that it should be repealed. If there was anything we could do as a committee, I would definitely put the motion forward that be repealed because we have no jurisdiction to do such a thing. And I felt very bad about that whole thing, that whole situation. And that's just my opinion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, anybody else? No.
Well, I
Yes.
will take ownership because I was the one that suggested that bringing in an arborist, and I will go on record to say that, okay, if we're outside of our scope, I apologize for that. But I also feel, and this is my own personal opinion, that we do need to start looking at preservation of tree canopy within the town. And I know that if we don't have tools for it, I understand that, then maybe we need to start developing some tools that we can start using.
But that comment goes to council because they are the only ones who can provide those tools. We can't. We only work within the established framework. So,
I think as Dwight
and
said,
we have made that recommendation to council as it stands.
Mr. Chair, I'll just note that council has received from multiple angles to a request to look at an urban forestry strategy, and staff are going to start to be digging into that shortly. So through the Environmental Advisory Committee, as well as through one of the declarations of climate change emergency, that was brought forward as something that we should be looking at and focusing on from the municipal plan. So to let PAC know, we will be looking to establish an urban forestry strategy.
I'm pleased to hear that. Now, going to what Councillor Hainan raised, Mr. Knopper, does it make sense for us to try to do something now, or should we let the process go through the provincial board since the appeal has been made to them?
I'll let Mr. Gopin back me on this, but I think at this point, since it's already going through the appeal process, that we just allow it to complete its course. I'm not sure if there's anything under the Community Planning Act, and maybe Mr. Gopin can elaborate if there is a way that PAC can modify this if possible.
So there's really nothing in the Community Planning Act that deals with revisiting PAC decisions. And as far as I know, it isn't something that happens unless a new application is brought forward. So my advice has been let the process play out. And if the applicant feels that they should appeal, that should come from them and not from the committee. So I think the process is playing out, and appeals happen all the time in planning. This will actually be my first appeal, so it's a good experience for me. Alex has had a few, so it's nothing to feel bad about. This is a totally normal part of the process, and it's why you have these layers of accountability and authority. So we'll work through it, and it's not really a big deal. I think that the chair's points are very good points to make about overall process in general, but these things happen, and that's why these bodies and processes exist.
Great, thank you. That's sort of, yeah, that would be my take on it as well. So although I understand where you're coming from, Councillor Hainan, I think we need to let the process play out in this case, and all will be well. Yes, sir.
Just one more comment, at least us bringing it forth to the public right now, we've acknowledged the fact that we overstepped a bit of our bounds, and therefore, I think that we've done a lot of good at repairing some damage. Whether we make a motion, whether we do anything, at least it's recognized, and that to me is half the battle. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Anything further? If not, then I will declare the meeting adjourned or terminated. Thank you very
Good night,
much.
everybody.
Good night.